Hi everybody, I'm Pia from Stitches and Scraps. Today I'm going to show you how to sew a box bottom bag lining with a pocket. I've started by cutting 3 pieces of fabric. 2 of them are the front and back panels of the bag. Each one is 18 inches wide by 16.5 inches tall. Then there's the smaller piece, which is 7 inches wide by 14 inches tall, that will become the pocket. Let's look at the pocket first. This is the piece that's going to become the pocket. The first thing we're going to do is fold it in half to make it a square, and we're doing that with right sides together. So this is the pocket, but flipped inside out, all right? What we're going to do is we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance along both side edges and just about 2 inches in on the top edge from each side. So one seam will come like this and one seam will come like that. And that will leave about a 2-inch gap at the top, which we can then use to flip this right side out again. And then we'll end up with a square pocket that has no wrong side to it. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and sew that, and then I'll come right back. All right, I finished those 2 seams. You can see that I've gone just along the sides and a little bit in. So that leaves this gap here, which I can use to turn the pocket around. This edge I haven't sewn because that gives me a nice clean edge for the top of the pocket when I attach it to the bag. So let's go ahead and turn this right side out. And here's where a crochet hook is really handy for poking those corners out so that they're nice and crisp. Now notice that over the gap, the fabric naturally wants to fold along the line where the seam is. We're going to let it do that because when we sew this to the bag, we'll just sew right over that opening. We don't even have to top stitch it because we're going to be top stitching it to the bag, and that will close it for us at that time. Now I have this nice flat square, which I'm going to press to make it really nice and crisp and easy to sew onto my front panel when I'm ready. When I lay out the front panel, I want to be sure that my pattern is facing up. Now in my case, my pattern's all over the place, but I'm using this as a judge for which way up is, and this flower I want facing up. So I've got that facing up, and the width of this piece is the longer dimension. This is 18 inches here and only 16.5 this way. Why, when we're making a square bag, do we have a rectangular panel? Well, that's because part of this width is going to become the sides of the bag. So we want to be very sure that we actually have this lined up with the long way being the width, okay? So make sure you have your panel in the correct position first before you try to sew the pocket on. I folded the bottom edge of this front panel under just to get it out of my way. And now it's time to place the pocket. So first things first, look at your pocket and make sure that you've got this opening at the bottom, okay? Then make sure that you've got the right side going up and the pocket's not upside down. So looking at my pattern, this was the flower that I said I'm using as my gauge for which way is up and which way is down, and here it's pointing down. If I just flip it over this way, now it's going in the correct direction. Now, as far as how far down from the top, I want mine 2.5 inches from the top, because when I put a 1/2 inch seam at the top here, this becomes 2 inches, okay? So 2.5 inches from the top edge is where I'm going to lay the top edge of my pocket. I also want to make sure it's centered side to side. So this was 7 inches when we started, right? This pocket. We put a 1/2 inch seam on this side and a 1/2 inch seam on this side. This is now 6 inches because we lost a 1/2 inch on each side. So now I'm going to place it centered on this 18-inch piece of fabric, which means 6 inches, 6 inches, 6 inches makes 18 inches. So it should be 6 inches from each side. I need to move it over a little bit more. Okay, there's 6 inches from that side, so butt it up against that. And then let's make sure it's 6 inches here. Great. Okay, 2.5 inches here. Good. And then to make sure it's straight and not crooked, let's make sure it's 2.5 inches here as well. And it is. So my pocket's nice and straight and in line where I want it to be on my fabric. Now I'm going to pin it into place, and then I'll take it to the machine and sew it down. So when I sew it down, I'm going to be sure not to sew the top edge, right? I'm going to just sew the side and bottom edges, and I'm going to sew them very close to the edge of the fabric. Not the full 1/2 inch seam, but just as close to the edge as I can, top stitch around this. Okay, and I'm going to take this to my machine, and I'm going to sew this side edge, this bottom edge, and this side edge. Now, I learned a little trick from my friend Jessie. Her blog is Jessie at Home. She said that when you get up to here, if you sew a little triangle at this corner, just like that, so you're coming in a little bit along the top edge, so the top edge doesn't quite go all the way to the corner, right? So come up on your seam here, go over a little bit, and then back down again like that to make a little triangle here. She said that actually will keep your pocket more stable and keep it from ripping. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll show it to you up close when it's done. My pocket is in place, sewn as close to the edge as I could get it, with tiny little triangles at the corner. Let me zoom in a little bit. There you go. You can see my little triangle here. It's just like 4 stitches over and 4 stitches down. That's all it is. And then this is sewn really, really close to the edge here, and there is a matching triangle there. So my pocket is sewn on. The next thing to do is to sew my front and back panels together. And I'm just going to leave this front panel just like it is. I'm going to take my back panel and lay it on top with right sides together. But first I want to make sure it's facing the right way. So again, with this one, I look, there's the flower I'm using as my guide, so I make sure that is facing up. Okay, and I make sure that this is my long side and this is my short side, and then I'm just going to flip it over like this. So top to top and sides to sides. And I'm going to line it up, grab some handy clips over here, and start clipping it together all the way around the edge. Now obviously I'm not going to sew the top edge, I'm only going to sew the bottom and the sides, so I don't need to clip the top, but I want to make sure my corners are lined up. So let's put one clip right there. And once everything is nicely clipped in place, I'll take it to my sewing machine and I'll sew the side and bottom edge only, not the top edge. I've left the top edge open, but I've seen the sides and the bottom. Okay, I have not turned it right side out yet because now comes the fun part. We're going to do the boxed corners. We want to cut a 1-inch square out of each of the bottom corners. Now that's 1 inch not from the edge of the selvage, but 1 inch from the edge of the seam. Okay, so we're counting from the seam, not the selvage. So I'm going to go 1 inch here from the seam. See that? There's my seam. There's 1 inch out, and I'm going to just make a line right here. Now when I go here, I'm going to line up with that line and go 1 inch here and make a line right there. So that is my mark, 1 inch from each selvage. Sorry, 1 inch from each seam. Now when I draw these lines, they should each be 1 inch long. There. And there. You want to check your measurements twice because you can only cut once. An old teacher told me that. Okay, that's where I'm going to be cutting. Let's do the other corner. That is a 1 inch corner, and that is a 1 inch corner right there. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those corners now. And it's okay that I'm cutting through a seam here. It's okay, it's not going to unravel. Now, when I fold this flat, and by that I mean I'm going to take these two sides, I'm going to pull them apart, and I'm going to make the seam line up. Actually, you can iron this down if that helps you, but you don't have to. You can just kind of finger press it down for right now. You can also trim these a bit if that helps. You can trim your seam allowance because you're going to be sewing anyway, so you can trim a little bit of your seam allowance off real close here at the corner. And you don't have to do that clipping, that's not in the pattern, it just makes it easier to see things, so little trick. And we're laying this corner flat, and I'm going to just take this whole thing and lay it like this, okay? There we go. Now you can see this corner, and I want to make sure that my seams line up. Don't pull them apart, just make sure they line up. There we go. Line up the seams perfectly like that, and then flatten out the rest of the bag around it so that your seams are perfectly aligned. Okay, my seams are aligned, my corner's laying flat. All right, now where I'm going to seam, well, before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in this, or a clip, just to make sure that I've got that nice and flat. Just like that. Okay. Now I'm going to sew my 1/2 inch allowance from here, and that should give me, let's see, if I go up a 1/2 inch, my seam line is going to be right around here, right there. If I do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that should come out to 3 inches across. So if I do a seam allowance like that, there we go, that gives me a 3 inch line across there. Do the same thing on the other corner. So that's the corners, and I'm going to go ahead and sew those. And I'm also going to press this seam nice and flat. The other thing that we need to do is we need to turn down this top edge to give us a nice finished edge. We can go ahead and do that right now. You want to turn it down by about a 1/2 inch. So you can eyeball that or you can measure it, but that's about a 1/2 inch right there. So I'm going to turn that down right there and clip that in place as well. And then I'll do the other side, about a 1/2 inch down. There. And clip that in place. Now I'll go all the way around and kind of do that same 1/2 inch seam allowance and clip it in place all the way around. So here's the top edge ready to sew. Now this is a 1/2 inch already, so I can't do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm probably going to do like 3/8 of an inch to get it close to the edge of where I folded this. Technically, you don't actually even need to sew this. You could just press it down into place, and then it's going to hold when you sew it into the bag. But I like having that extra seam here just to keep it nice and neat and make it easy to sew into the bag later. I finished sewing the top edge down, and this was again at 3/8 inch, and then I sewed that 3 inch seam at a 1/2 inch away from what we cut to make that boxed corner. And you can see that that's made a nice boxy bottom. I've also ironed my seams flat and open just to make it a little neater and to make it fit nicer when it goes into the bag. So the last thing we have to do now, because our lining is complete, the last thing we have to do is put this into our bag and sew it into place. Notice I'm not turning it right side out at all because this is exactly how it goes into the bag. So for this lining, I made this lining to go with this bag, which is bag number 5 in the 2022 Bag Along Cal. And this is the Classic Cables Tote. Grab the handles. So we've made the lining to go into here. So let's go ahead and shove this lining inside. So I open up my bag, take the lining and just set it inside and push it down into those corners. And check that this side seam lines up with the middle of the side panel on the bag. So the bag has this side panel, and I'm going to make sure that this side seam lines up perfectly with the middle of it. So I counted my stitches at the top, and this is right here is exactly the middle of that side edge. So I'm going to clip this into place right there, and I'm going to do the same with the other side edge right there. And then I can kind of evenly space the rest of it around and clip it all into place all the way around. One thing I want to pay attention to is to find the middle of this pocket and make sure that that lines up with the center of the bag as well, so that the pocket isn't off center at all. Okay, I've got that all clipped in place, and I'm going to do this stitching by hand because I want it to be really nice and neat up at this top edge here. So I've attached my thread, and I'm just making some small back stitches, making sure as I go through that I'm catching the yarn on the other side. So just like that. And I'm going very close to the edge of the lining, and I'm directly underneath the top of the stitches on the crochet. So that way from the front, all you'll see is the top row of those stitches, just like that, and you won't see any of the lining peeking out. And I'm just going to go all the way around the top edge like this, and then I'll come back and show it to you when it's all done. Our top seam is done, and now so is our lining, complete with a handy pocket. I can pull it out from the bottom, and you can see the whole lining. There are the boxed bottoms right there, and it just goes right back into the bag. And that is how you make a lining for a box bottom bag with a pocket. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, share it with your friends, or leave me a comment. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel for more great videos. Thanks for watching.